Since the eviction moratorium issued by the Centers for Disease Control went into effect September 4th, there has been growing evidence that eviction filings have fallen sharply in many cities. We'll hear next week from Peter Hepburn of the Eviction Lab, who will talk about their latest findings that during the second week of September, with new rules on the books, eviction filings have declined in about 16 cities where Eviction Lab is currently tracking data. It's really quite amazing what we've seen so far. In Cincinnati, for example, filings fell by 79% in early September. In Richmond, Virginia, filings dropped 89% from about 300 in the first week of September to just about 30 the following week. And in Cleveland, there were 0 eviction filings last week. Overall, it seems clear that the moratorium is working to stop evictions, but we have so much work ahead of us to make sure that renters know about the moratorium and the steps they have to take to be protected, and to ensure that protections are felt consistently across the country. Later on the call, we'll hear from Jim Baker about how some corporate landlords are moving forward to quickly file evictions before renters know about these protections. And we'll hear from John Pollock and others about the continued need for right to counsel and the work to educate renters about how to be protected. All of this points to just how important it is for us to ensure that renters know their rights and have the resources that they need to stay in their homes. We'll also hear from experts working to ensure that low-income people collect their stimulus checks and ways advocates can help. And we'll hear from field updates from Alabama, Oregon, and Alaska. Before we get started, we do have a special speaker guest today, Senator Brian Schatz from Hawaii. He is a key member of the Appropriations and the Banking Committees. He serves as the chair of the Senate Democratic Special Committee on Climate Crisis, which clearly has broad implications for the work of this coalition on disaster housing recovery. He's also the chief deputy whip, a leadership position that gives him greater role in shaping policy and communications for Senate Democrats. We've worked very closely with his office over the years, especially on housing and disaster recovery issues. So we're so glad that he's able to join us. Senator, are you with us?
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure when we organized this call for you, you probably weren't expecting to have so much changes and chaos on Congress right now with the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But I'm wondering if you could tell us what the state of play is and what's happening in Congress on a relief package.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all the people on the call for the good work that everybody's doing to keep people in housing and to assist people in finding housing. I worked with Sherrod Brown to co-sponsor the Emergency Rental Assistance and Rental Market Stabilization Act, which appropriates $100 billion of rental assistance to deal with the inevitable bill that will be due whenever the forbearance runs out. But my assessment of the situation is that the likelihood of passing a bill in the next couple of weeks has gone from low to even lower. The sort of political bandwidth of the Congress is going to be occupied almost exclusively by passing a government funding bill as opposed to a stimulus bill. And then, of course, by honoring Justice Ginsburg, she'll be lying in state in the state capitol on Friday, the U.S. Capitol on Friday. And it just doesn't feel like there's a lot of movement towards a COVID relief package. Now, politics being what it is, anything could change in the next 24 hours, but I know a lot of you sort of need to know not what I'm planning on doing, not what I would like to get passed, but what is the likelihood of something passing. And I just want to be straight with you. I don't think it looks very good in the next couple of weeks.
No, I appreciate that brutal honesty about where things are right now. But of course, when Congress returns after the elections, something will have to get done, because as you mentioned, when the moratorium ends, renters are going to owe back rent, and we don't know the the breadth of the other economic impacts of the pandemic, what do you think advocacy groups can do to help build that pressure over the next couple of months for when Congress returns?
Well, first of all, I think the thing that you're doing right now, which is making sure that renters are aware of their rights, is absolutely critical. This is something we did back home, even through our office. We made sure that renters understood their rights under both a state moratorium and the national moratoriums. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is to educate the public about the difference between forbearance and forgiveness. It sort of feels the same on the first of the month until you've got 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 months rent due at the end of the emergency period. And so I think that's what we've got to do, and take housing out of partisan politics, just to understand that people in blue states and red states are all facing the same crisis together, and that we're likely going to have to pass a bill at the end of the calendar year, and this has to be an essential aspect of any legislation that we pass related to COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that something our partners have been thinking a lot about, and we've been thinking a lot about, is just how this pandemic has been, making very stark the need for transformational change, once Congress has already addressed the immediate needs after this pandemic. And I'm wondering, what do you think COVID-19 means for housing policy going forward? How does it change things?
That's a question I'd rather turn around to you folks, because I think you need to inform me about that. I know it is customary for politicians to have a pat answer to every question, but that's something I'd like to do a little more deep thinking about. I will offer this, that, from the federal side, there's only so much we can do. Even if we provide $100 billion in subsidy, even if we quadrupled the HUD budget and jacked up the LIHTC amounts in each state, it's still not enough. And not in every place, because every market is different, but in lots of markets, certainly Honolulu and across the state of Hawaii, the problem is one of the government itself, usually the local government, creates scarcity of housing, and then sort of gazes at its navel and wonders why there isn't enough housing. This is something we're creating the scarcity of from exclusionary zoning and other restrictive policies. And I think it's important as a progressive for all of us to kind of reach out to other folks who are sort of officially with us in this fight, but don't understand the history of redlining and exclusionary zoning, and how much that is the great grandson of Jim Crow, and to make sure that we don't have people who are officially for inclusion, but when it comes to a project near their house, they suddenly come up with a bunch of reasons why this project is not the most appropriate. So I'm a big believer that, at least from the federal side on down, we ought to get a bipartisan movement for yes in my backyard. I have a rather modest bill with a Republican senator to kind of push this idea along. But I think, similar to what we've done with the climate coalition, we've got to build a coalition for housing that includes people who care about climate, people who care about civil justice, people who care about educational and health equity, and people who care about more narrowly understood housing policy. But we've got to do some of the politics to call out some of our friends who are officially for housing, but as it turns out, usually not anywhere near them. One of the things I used to say in Hawaii, as I was the leader of the Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, and people would oppose, wind farms and solar farms and geothermal, is if we're going to get to 100% clean energy, we're going to see some of this energy development. We're going to see it in an island state. And likewise, if you're for housing people, some of those housing projects have got to be near you in particular, not in the abstract, but in the specific instances where it's a tough call for you and your property values and all the rest of it. So that's one thing I'd love to work with this group on, because I see us failing time and time again because of these NIMBY issues.
No, that's a great point. I know many folks on the line have been working in their communities to promote affordable housing and have run into the same NIMBYism issues that you're talking about. And we are happy to work with you on your legislation and help build support for it. And as you mentioned, there's already bipartisan support for your bill. Yes, in our backyard. But there's more we can all be doing to help support your legislation, and we'll look forward to doing that. There's another bill that you've worked on to authorize and to reform the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. It's a mouthful, CDBGDR, that would help make it more equitable and help ensure that resources are equitably spent on both homeowners and renters and people experiencing homelessness. I'm wondering if you could tell us how we can continue to build bipartisan support for that legislation too.
This is a great bill, and we've worked with your coalition on this. It basically codifies HUD CDBG DR program. They don't really have clear rules. They sort of reinvent it every time there's a new disaster, and it becomes a creature of statute, but more alarmingly, a creature of, whoever the disaster recovery people are in any particular locality. This has to be done according to best practices. And it has to be done with an understanding that disasters hit in uneven ways in terms of educational attainment and race and economic class. And so we want to make sure that in any disaster, both the prep, the response, and the recovery, there are extra vulnerable people, and all of the disaster relief that is pushed out through the federal government should have on it a lens that accommodates the basic idea, and we've seen it through the COVID crisis more severely than anywhere else, that people are unevenly impacted by this, and the federal funding that is provided has to account for that.
Yeah, absolutely. We are really excited about that bill, and as folks on the call know, it passed out of the House already, and we're hopeful to see it get some movement in the Senate. We think it's a really important bill for providing that framework and structure to make sure that disasters are more equitable going forward. And I just want to thank you for your leadership on this. You really have been leading the way on disaster housing recovery issues in many different ways. And we thank you for your leadership on that.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to everybody on the call. I know everyone's fighting the good fight, and I'll do whatever I can for everybody who needs housing.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Senator.
Take care.
Great. It's so great to hear from Senator Schatz on the call. If you haven't checked out his Twitter account, you should do that. He always gives really insightful, comments on what's happening in Capitol Hill. I know I always follow him, so just a little shout out for that before we move on in our agenda. Next, we'll focus on the federal eviction moratorium and how it is impacting communities across the nation. We're going to start with Jim Baker from the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. Jim, are you on the line?
I am. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, great.
Very good. Should I just
go right ahead?
Great, thanks so much. So just to introduce myself, my name is Jim Baker with the Private Equity Stakeholder Project. We are a nonprofit organization that works with stakeholder groups such as workers, community groups, tenants, homeowners, et cetera, on issues, impacts of private equity and similar Wall Street investments on people's lives. We have focused on impacts on housing for the last few years, as we've seen private equity firms and similar financial firms, create the institutional single-family rental industry, increasingly invest in apartment communities, and then most recently invest heavily in manufactured home communities around the country. And we were already aware that some firms had adopted aggressive eviction practices before the pandemic. And so early on in the pandemic, started trying to track eviction filings by private equity firms and other corporate landlords. And I'll say what I mean by that. We have focused on landlords with thousands of units, right? Or sometimes, tens of thousands of units. So tried to focus on eviction filings by some of the larger firms. And specifically have looked a bit more closely. We've are looking broadly at a bunch of different geographies. Over the last month or so, have looked a bit more closely at a handful of geographies, both what was happening in early to mid-August, and comparing it to what's been happening since the CDC eviction moratorium was announced and took effect. And so specifically, I've been looking at counties in Arizona, specifically Maricopa County, which includes Phoenix, Texas, Harris County, which includes Houston, and Tarrant County, which includes Fort Worth. In Tennessee, Shelby County, which includes Memphis. In Georgia, DeKalb County and Clayton County, which are part of Atlanta and part of the suburbs. And in Florida, a number of counties, including Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, Orange, Hillsborough, and Pinellas. And we've tried to, like I said, we tried to focus on properties owned by corporate landlords, including real estate investment trusts, private equity firms, and again, other companies with thousands of units or more. We've gathered data publicly from publicly available court records. And then also, I apologize for the background noise, also used corporation filings, UCC filings, real estate records, and company websites to identify, from the court filings, the landlords. If you could advance the next slide. Thanks so much. And part of what we've seen, unfortunately, is in those geographies that I just mentioned that we've followed, is an acceleration in eviction cases filed by these corporate landlords. So when we looked at those geographies during the week of August 3rd through 9th, there were 170 eviction filings by different corporate landlords. Yet the week immediately following the announcement, so basically beginning on September 2nd, on Wednesday, September 2nd, so through the following Tuesday, we saw an almost fivefold, actually a more than fivefold increase to 952 eviction cases filed by corporate landlords in those markets. The next week, September 7th through 13th, there was a bit of a dip, and there's obviously some overlap. There was also a holiday that week, saw 728 filings. And then last week, we actually saw a substantial increase. Now, that's again, just in those specific markets, but saw 1,860 eviction cases filed by corporate landlords filed by corporate landlords. And I would say in some places, we've actually seen, this is part of an acceleration of kind of a broader acceleration of filings that we've seen. So for example, Tarrant County in Texas, the week of August 3rd through 9th, there were 122 evictions overall. And that's all landlords, including the corporate landlords. September 2nd through 8th, again, immediately after the CDC moratorium was announced, there were 243 evictions filed by all landlords. And then this past week, there were 260 evictions filed by all landlords. In some counties, we've also seen that filings by corporate landlords, kind of bigger companies, make up the vast majority of eviction filings. So in DeKalb County, Georgia, last week there were 656 eviction cases filed overall, and at least 550 of them, or about 84%, were by corporate landlords and are included in the data I mentioned. Hang on, sorry. If you go to the next slide. And oh yeah, it came out very small. I apologize for the small size of the text. It came out a bit smaller than I'd hoped. But I just want to walk through some of the larger filers and then also talk through kind of some of what we've seen. Part of what was surprising to us is that, was seeing evictions by, really some of the largest landlords in the country among the filings over the last couple of weeks. So among the filings just since the CDC moratorium was announced. So these include filings by Mid-America Apartments, which has more than 100,000 units, Graystar, which has more than 100,000 units and owned and 600,000 managed, Invitation Homes, which is the largest single-family rental landlord with 80,000 rental homes, Yes Communities, which is a very large mobile home or manufactured home park owner with 56,000 home sites, as well as a bunch of other gigantic investment firms like Prudential, Starwood Capital, Eaton Vance, and the Carlyle Group. We also saw some landlords accounting for a disproportionate share of the filings. So Ventron Management, which has a number of apartment complexes in Georgia and Florida, had 162 cases, or has filed 162 cases since the CDC moratorium was announced. A company called Western Wealth Capital has filed 94 cases. Blue Magma Residential has filed 87 cases. Crown Bay Group and another company called Ani Group have both filed 74 cases. So, we're seeing some number of landlords, really sort of, it's not kind of created equally, right? We're seeing some landlords, we're seeing, filings by many very large landlords and, by hundreds of different corporate landlords. Some landlords are sort of standing out in terms of being especially aggressive with filings. If you could go to the next, actually just go to the 2 slides ahead. I just have 2 things of, yeah. Could you just go 2 slides forward? Great. So I just put my contact information up there. And just, I don't know if we're taking questions now or if what makes sense, but generally we have tried to, what I will say is this first, is that the data, we are happy to make it available to anybody who's interested. We've been sharing the data on eviction filings that we've seen and who the landlords are that are filing those filings with attorneys, with housing groups around the country. So if there are ways that our research and what we've been finding can be helpful, or if you have questions or comments or anything else like that, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jim. If you do have time, I'd love to ask you a couple of questions, and also to remind folks that they can enter questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. But I'm wondering, can you tell us, how was it that you chose the states that you looked into? Was that what were the factors that you were looking at when determining which states to investigate?
So we, we were looking, it's a bit, it depends a bit on kind of where information is available, but also we were looking at large, large geographies, large kind of metro areas where, where there have been evictions happening, right, beforehand, right? So this is, there had been some number of evictions happening previously, either at properties that weren't covered by the CARES Act moratorium that was in place previously. So, what I will say is these are markets, these are kind of geographies where we've seen filings, for some time, although there does appear to be an escalation in recent weeks.
Yeah, and some folks are asking if you could have any way of being able to discern, how of these eviction filings, were these for non-payment of rent, which is covered by the eviction moratorium, or do we know if they were for other reasons?
So what I'll say is this: so we don't know in every case, but in Florida and Georgia, where a number of cases are from, you can see that. And in the vast majority of cases where we've looked at them, they have been non-payment of rent eviction cases.
Yeah, it's really disturbing, obviously, that landlords would move forward with this while renters are supposed to be protected, and especially because we know that when the CDC issued the moratorium, they made it very clear that evictions are not only harmful to individuals, but they make it more difficult for our country to overcome this pandemic. So it's really frustrating to see that move forward. I am getting a question from folks about whether you can list again what your sources were for the data that you pulled from.
Yeah, so we, definitely. So we used the local, so I would say the county court, like county courts, different local county courts in different places for the list of cases. And then to identify who the owners were, we cross-referenced that against corporation filings, real estate records, and UCC filings. So all different public records, and we did it through LexisNexis. So that's just like a database. So we used that data, sort of public record data, to go from because many cases are filed under a particular LLC, to go from who's the landlord that's behind that particular LLC.
Yeah, that seems like an enormous project to take on. For people who are in states that aren't covered by your data, do you have any advice about how they could go about analyzing or collecting that information?
Yeah, I think that one thing I will say is it is a task. So two things. One is we are absolutely looking to expand the places that we are tracking. So please reach out, and happy to sort of talk to folks directly about what we've been doing, and happy to kind of help as much as possible. The other thing that I would say is, perhaps unfortunately it gets easier the more you do it, because particular like beyond the sort of like gathering the case data in the first place, particular landlords show up over and over again as plaintiffs in filings. So what I would say is, yes, it is a bit of a task at first, but it's definitely not insurmountable, and happy to help out however we can. This is all based on publicly available data. Like I said, we did use LexisNexis to sort of help figure out who the particular particular landlord is behind different filings, but it is something that folks could replicate in different places. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jim, for joining us. I know that we at the coalition were really distressed to see that such landlords are moving forward before renters have the real possibility of protecting themselves. And this information is really critical, not only for our work in pushing for even stronger protections for renters, but also it really underscores the need for long-term solutions like emergency rental assistance and other investments. So thank you so much for joining with us. We appreciate it.
Of course. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that one of the questions that has been asked is, how is it possible that landlords can win in court when there are eviction moratoriums in place? And I think that's a really good segue to our next speaker, John Pollack from the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel. John, I'm wondering if you could tell us about what this moratorium means for your long-standing work to improve right to counsel.
Sure, happy to. So I'm just going to quickly just give like a minute about where we were, where this right to counsel sort of conversation was before the CDC moratorium and COVID. Before COVID, basically, we were looking at a movement that had grown significantly across the country, as this article sort of suggests, but from Next City. We had actually seen in just the span of 3 years, 5 cities, including the city with the most evictions in the country, New York City, pass a right to counsel for tenants. And then federal, state, and local bills to basically expand tenant representation or provide a right to counsel. And as you can see from the spread from a geographic standpoint, these efforts were happening all over the country, in the South, in the Midwest, in the West, et cetera. So the movement was really significantly surging prior to COVID. And in addition, and this goes to, I think, what we're going to talk about in just a moment, sorry, my slides went a little too fast. We just, in the first few years of the cities that have a right to counsel, we've just seen incredible results of how providing a right to counsel avoids mass displacement. In New York City, 84% of the tenants are staying in their homes as a result of having counsel, 67% in San Francisco. The filing rates, which are have been historically very high, are starting to decline because some of the evictions that are being filed are frivolous. This ties in directly to, I think, the question about the CDC moratorium that we'll get to in a moment. And more tenants are participating in the eviction process. The default rates across the country are extremely high, often over 50%. And we're seeing the right to counsel bring that number way down. You can see here in New York City, the representation rate before the right to counsel was just 1%, which is an extremely low number compared to the landlords who are typically represented 90% of the time or more. So what happened in COVID basically is 3 things have occurred. The increased complexity, which speaks to the CDC moratorium and the other ones, the increased risks to tenants in terms of their health, and also now with the CDC moratorium, this risk of perjury, and increased landlord illegal behavior. I would just also mention that although I'm going to talk about those 3 things, I would just flag also that as we discuss rental assistance, which is one of the 3 essential prongs to solving this problem, many tenants are going to need help applying for and obtaining rental assistance. And then if they get rental assistance, they will actually need help using it in the eviction process, because if an eviction's already been filed, getting that rental assistance to be applied can be a tricky question under certain state laws. So they're going to need counsel in order to make sure that that rental assistance is actually used effectively. So what we're looking at right now basically is an incredibly complex world that tenants have to navigate. The CDC moratorium itself is complex, in part because it doesn't self-execute. Tenants have to take an affirmative step before they're protected. There's been disparate interpretations of the CDC moratorium by different courts. We're seeing orders coming out of the courts that are saying different things about what it stops. Even though the CDC order is extremely clear that it stops all landlord activity, we're still seeing some disparate interpretation and enforcement by the courts. We're seeing some landlords trying to put tenants on the stand, which was really not contemplated at all by the CDC moratorium. It clearly states that the landlords shall not take any action once they receive the declaration. If tenants are cross-examined on the stand, that's going to be an extraordinarily problematic scenario, because the landlord will have counsel and the tenant will not. That is just basically universally true in this country. And when you have an imbalanced evidentiary examination or a cross-examination like that, it will be a disastrous outcome for the tenant where they are telling the truth, because it will be very difficult for them to stand up to that kind of cross-examination. So the CDC moratorium has really ramped up, as good as it is and as much protection as it provides, it has really ramped up the need for counsel to ensure that there's enforcement happening equally and evenly across the country, and that tenants are protected in the way that the CDC moratorium said it was supposed to protect tenants, which is, again, halting all landlord activity once the declaration is received. The additional layer of complexity is that you have these state and local moratoria also, some of which are more protective than the CDC moratorium. And the CDC was very clear that their act did not preclude or preempt states and cities from doing something more protective. So tenants basically, in some places, may not have to fill out the declaration, and it can be very confusing for them to know exactly how they're supposed to proceed in their specific jurisdiction. And then you also have the fact that the moratoria at the city and state level often change. As they're extended, they're often tweaked and altered, and they often cover different stages. Some of them may say, you know, we stop everything, or we only stop executions, or we don't allow late fees, or, you know, the variables are significant across jurisdictions, which basically for a tenant without counsel, it's going to be impossible to navigate. And our real concern also is that the courts themselves are not going to understand what's going on, because there are so many moving pieces. Without counsel for the tenants to basically make the court aware of all the protections that tenants are entitled to, there's actually a quite good chance that tenants are going to get evicted in violation of the law, because the courts themselves don't know, are not able to keep up with all of these changes. We've already seen some courts that are basically unaware of the CDC moratorium, don't understand it. So that, again, without counsel, we're looking at a really significant problem of the CDC's action being undercut by disparate or non-existent enforcement. The other problem I would say too is that the CDC moratorium does not cover all evictions. It has some explicit exceptions in it. And so those evictions are still going forward. And then, you know, of course, there are going to be other evictions in the future when all these moratoria expire. And right now, what we saw before the CDC moratorium and continuing on with the proceedings that are still happening is it's basically chaotic. The courts are, in some cases, still requiring people to come in person at great risk to themselves. Where they are holding remote hearings, where there are problems with tenants who don't have access to the technology to participate. They don't have access to interpreters. They don't have access to services for people with disabilities that would allow them to participate in a Zoom call. They have difficulty sharing documents. All of these problems that I'm describing here, in person and remote, essentially disappear if tenants have counsel, because their counsel is the one that will participate in the hearing and really negotiate with the landlord's attorney to solve this outside of court. That's what we see happen, to have a fair and equitable solution negotiated between both attorneys. And just as a quick word, some courts are moving towards mediation as a way to try to resolve these disputes. What we've seen from the data on mediation is that when you have mediation without counsel, the results are essentially the same as if you had mediation as if you had no mediation. Essentially, the mediation has almost no impact on what happens to the tenants. They're still ordered to be removed at pretty much the same rate as they are if they had not gone through mediation at all. So there's data showing that counsel actually in mediation is what makes a significant difference. So I mentioned the illegality. Basically, even during the CARES Act moratorium period and all the way through the summer, basically there were hundreds and thousands of illegal evictions that violated the moratoria, filed either knowingly or unknowingly by landlords in violation of the CARES Act moratorium, and also state and local moratorium. And already in this era, we're starting to get reports of the courts basically moving forward, or landlords moving forward, despite having gotten the declarations from tenants, which is very concerning. Again, goes to why we need counsel for this situation, because the CDC moratorium and really any law is only as good as the enforcement to make it meaningful. And that's where we really have this need for a right to counsel. And then we also have, on the sort of even earlier level, we have landlords who are not even bothering to go to court. They're simply just trying to force tenants out or scare them out, turning off their water, turning off their utilities, changing the locks, sometimes physically threatening them, trying to drive them out of their homes before they can exercise their rights. That is a very disturbing trend. And there's a statistic I often quote from Nevada where during the pandemic, they reported that in 2019, this regional legal services program had only had 12 calls in their region for lockouts, illegal lockouts. And during the pandemic, they had gotten over 2,000 calls in a very short amount of time for this exact same problem. So that's the kind of thing, again, when you don't have counsel to basically protect tenants, make sure they know what their rights are. And if the tenants have had that happen to them, get their units back, because self-help is, there is no self-help eviction in this country anymore. And then, of course, after the CDC and the state moratoria expire, we're going to be dealing with an absolute wave of evictions. And, we hope that rental assistance will come. And in fact, what we talk about is essentially being necessary for what needs to happen is basically this needs to be a three-pronged solution. We need to have a right to counsel, we need to have rent relief, and we need to have a moratorium. We need all three of those. All three of those pieces address a different piece. The moratorium stops things where they are. The rent relief speaks to the largest problem, which is that people don't have the money right now because of job loss and illness. And the right to counsel is for all the reasons I just mentioned, the enforcement. So we're working with other national groups, including NLIHC, on the advocacy on this three-legged stool, continuing the work to advance the right to counsel, continuing research and pilots that demonstrate the effectiveness of counsel, and continuing the advocacy to use CARES Act money for representation. The link that I have on this slide is to places that have done so. There are dozens of jurisdictions, city and state, that have appropriated CARES Act money for tenant rep. And that's a really good use of funding. I can tell you there are a lot of states that still have millions and millions and millions, in some cases billions of dollars of unappropriated CARES Act money that has to be spent by the end of the year, or some of that gets lost. So really pushing for that money to get used for rent relief and right to counsel or tenant representation is essential. This is my contact information. I'm happy to answer any questions, and thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much, John, for joining with us. And it's so great that you're continuing to point to these underlying structural issues with our legal system that disproportionately harms renters, and the need for real reforms to that. So thank you so much for your work on this. I don't think we have time for questions right now, but there are some questions in the Q&A box, in the chat box. If you could just, if you're able to stay on the line and answer those questions directly, that would be great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Great. Our next speaker is Julia Orduña from Texas Housers, who will talk about some successes there with their court systems. Julia, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Diane. Good afternoon. My name is Julia Orduña with Texas Housers, and we are grateful to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, Senator Schatz, and everyone on this call that continue to fight for equitable disaster recovery. I would also like to thank John and Jim for their presentations, and just echo everything that they mentioned are all issues we are seeing in Texas, and believe that the rights and protections are necessary. Texas Housers has been tracking eviction filings across the state and keeping an eye on the court proceedings during the pandemic. Some jurisdictions, like Travis County, continue to extend a moratorium and protect the tenants of Austin and surrounding areas. Harris County and the city of Houston, however, have not been able to set up any protections for tenants, and we have seen that the 16 justice of the peace in Harris County are working autonomously and independently of each other. This has manifested in a way that the tenant hearings will be significantly different depending on where they are tried. Some JPs are asking about and explaining the CDC order, as well as publicly streaming their courts to offer transparency. Other justices are only offering the option of in-person or telephonic hearings, have not set up their streaming technologies for public access, and are not mentioning or explaining the CDC order to other parties involved. Last week, I watched a justice evict tenant after tenant, only telling them the date by which they should move out, not offering any recourse or appeal, and only mentioning the CDC when one tenant finally presented it. After looking it over, the justice exclaimed that the hearing was out of their hands. And when pressed for clarification by the landlord to the length of this order, the judge stated that the landlord could call the CDC to clarify any questions. This week, there are over 600 eviction hearings set in Harris County JP courts, and another 400 currently set for the following week. It is obvious that the state of evictions is still unclear in Texas, and JPs are having a difficult time keeping up with and interpreting the law. We'd like to thank the Texas Supreme Court for issuing a much needed guidance for the CDC order on September 17th. We do believe that this will help clarify to the justice of the peace what is or is not applicable and necessary in the courts. We are also aware that the Texas Justice Court Training Center is working to teach and assist courts with the necessary information and technology and training to hold equitable and virtual hearings. We will continue to track these proceedings in Texas, and we hope that the government staff and justice officials begin to make the necessary changes to diminish the displacement during this pandemic. Thank you.
Oh, I realized I was on mute. Sorry about that. Julia, could you quickly tell us about some of the advocacy work that Texas Housers is doing to encourage courts and policymakers to implement the moratorium better?
Sure. We are trying to set up an eviction solidarity network. BASTA is one of the groups working in Travis County that was able to set this up previously in Travis. And once they had a moratorium, the eviction solidarity network stopped watching court. But because it is still an issue in Harris County, we've been trying to set that up to where the public can gain access to watching these court proceedings so we can see what's happening, see how judges are interpreting this order in real time, and actually try and make a change and maybe talk to the Justice Center and talk to the Supreme Court about some of the issues that we're seeing and how we can have those justice of the peace see that where the issues are and how they can change their behavior in court to be more equitable and more in line with the necessary changes during the pandemic. I will say that we have had some issue watching these courts. Like I said, some courts are only having in-person observation. Some of them are not allowing observation in their telephonic or their virtual hearings. So it has been a little difficult. We are trying to talk with the courts and push forward to really gain that transparency and better protections for the tenants.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia. I know we very closely follow what Texas Housers is doing because they do just amazing work and against really big odds in Texas. And so thank you so much for your work on this, and pass along our thanks to the rest of your team if you can.
Thank you so much. I definitely will.
Yeah, absolutely. I do see that there's a lot of questions in the Q&A box about what exactly is covered by the eviction moratorium, what steps that renters need to take to be protected, what happens to landlords who violate the order. And I'm just going to ask some of our partners on the LHC staff to share in the Q&A and share in the chat box some resources that folks can look at to find answers to those questions. Moving along, our next speaker is Jim Schatz from Michigan Poverty Law Program. I'm wondering, Jim, if you could give us an update about where things are in your state.
Yeah, I'll be glad to, Sarah, and hello, everyone. Yeah, housing advocates here have been frustrated that our state Supreme Court, and this is kind of building on an issue that Julia addressed, that our state Supreme Court, by its administrative arm, which is called SCAO, the State Court Administrative Office, hasn't shown stronger leadership in its guidance around the CDC order to state district courts, and it is the state district courts here that handle eviction cases. And other than issuing a FAQ document before the order even went into effect, which was really only a summary of the CDC order, except for saying that several issues the order addressed were matters of judicial interpretation, including items that I think and most advocates think are really straightforward, like the definition of evict and eviction. The state Supreme Court has been silent about the CDC order. And part of that is political. The Michigan Supreme Court has 7 members, so 4 members are needed to issue an order, including guidance to district courts around the CDC order that we've been urging. And it's interesting and maybe troubling that the Supreme Court here was much more cooperative and emphatic in its guidance about the CARES Act eviction filing moratorium. And it was the first, or at least one of the first courts to do that, and by requiring landlords to verify compliance with that moratorium. And there's some reasons that I probably don't have time to go into for our thinking why the court is more resistant to issuing more forceful and helpful guidance about the CDC order. You know, what we've been urging it to do is to at least require verification from landlords in any eviction case about whether they've gotten a CDC order declaration form from a tenant, and for the court to give notice to tenants about the CDC order and its potential protections for them, both before or so with what we call summons and complaint that they get served with, and then also at the first hearing in an eviction case, and that the Supreme Court SCAO direct these district courts that do eviction cases that they must not facilitate or further a landlord's actions in defiance of the CDC order, including giving a defiant landlord the remedy that they're seeking in a case, which is a judgment for possession. And so what we've seen, and Julia mentioned seeing this in Texas too, in the absence of guidance from our state Supreme Court, that these local district courts are filling that vacuum kind of along a continuum of responses. And you can see from the PowerPoint slide that they range from the good to the bad. And there's also then policy decisions about whether these responses apply to all cases or only cases in which a tenant has given their landlord the CDC declaration form. I guess pleasantly, on the whole, the responses I've heard about are better than I have expected. And so in rough terms, here's a non-exhaustive list of the responses I've heard about. And I'm grateful to advocates around Michigan for having given them to me. And I guess also rough is this PowerPoint slide, but wanted to fit everything onto one page. So I'll just quickly go through these. So some courts are very fortunately not for tenants in their jurisdictions, not accepting new eviction case filings. Other courts are dismissing or doing what's called administratively closing cases. Some are adjourning cases until January. Some cases are asking tenants, if they meet the requirements for the order's protections, and I'd be happy, you're mentioning, Sarah, there being questions about those, I'd be happy to try to address any of those as well. So actually, on the record, going through the 5 requirements for eligibility for the CDC order's protections with tenants, some, and John mentioned that this is a very troublesome occurrence that we're seeing in many places around the country, is that landlords and their attorneys are being very aggressive about questioning the truthfulness of the tenant declaration forms. And so we've got reports that some courts are refusing to inquire into the veracity of those forms, as we think they should or should not be doing, and recognizing that it's really beyond their authority and beyond the scope of the CDC order for them to do that. And some courts are providing, and there's a lot of overlap between these two, but some courts are informing tenants about the order, including the declaration form and tenant right to present that to landlords. And then, moving to the bad side of this continuum, that we have gotten reports of courts that themselves, not even by the landlords or their attorneys, but the courts that are on their own, sua sponte, to use the legal term, are interrogating tenants about their declaration forms and the contents or allegations or statements in those forms. Some cases are allowing, some courts, excuse me, are allowing cases to go up to the eviction order stage. So that last of the 5 typical stages in the eviction process, the actual eviction itself, which we think is really a misinterpretation, and John touched on this, of the definition of the term eviction under the CDC order, which says any action by a landlord or of a residential property with a right to pursue eviction or possessory action to remove or cause the removal of a covered person. And then there are courts that are taking even more extreme reactions to the order. What I've heard about is a court that is declaring that so-called anti-commandeering principles prohibit it from enforcing or giving any account to the CDC Oratorium. So an anti-commandeering, it's not that important to know, but is this principle that the federal government can't tell state governments, including their courts, what to adopt, when to adopt, or how to adopt or enforce federal law. And I mean, to the extent it's even a viable legal principle, there's real questions about that. That's not a legitimate issue because the order isn't instructing or directing state governments, including state courts, to do anything. It is a prohibition against private entities, so landlords, from taking certain actions. And so, really what we're saying is that, as I mentioned earlier, that it's the courts that have an interest in regulating this landlord behavior and shouldn't be facilitating landlord behavior that violates the law, which in this case is the CDC order. So it's been really interesting to see this range of responses, and it does make me wonder in the aggregate whether what courts are doing on their own might not be better for tenants than if our Supreme Court had issued guidance. So certainly it's working to the detriment of some tenants, but I do wonder if on the whole, because some courts are doing even beyond what likely the Supreme Court would have given them guidance about. So it might be, in some, a net benefit for tenants. I don't know.
Well, thank you so much, Jim, for your presentation. These are all really good things for advocates to be looking at their court systems and their states for. I appreciate you joining us and sharing this feedback. I know that, and that's an interesting question about the Supreme Court issuing guidance. I'll have to follow up with you about that. And if you could stay on the line, I think there are a couple of questions in the Q&A box, in the chat box, that you could answer for everybody, but we just don't have time in our schedule to take questions over the line. But thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to switch gears now and turn to focus on efforts to ensure that low-income people receive the stimulus payments that they are entitled to. We're going to hear from Roxy Keynes from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Roxy?
Hi, yes. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this time to share an update on the stimulus payments. So last week, the center launched a final 30-day push campaign to help people get their stimulus payments. People who were excluded from automatic delivery of the payments have until October 15th to sign up for their payments. And so as of today, we have 25 more days to help people get their payments. So I'm just going to walk through part of the need and the urgency, and then several resources that are available to help with this. So as I mentioned, most people got their payments automatically if they filed a tax return in the past 2 years, or if they were recipients of Social Security, SSI, disability, veterans pensions, or railroad retirement funds. So while this reached the masses, it still excluded or left out about 12 million people. The center did a research paper that estimated 12 million people were not getting those payments automatically. And of that 12 million, 9 million participate in SNAP or Medicaid. Recently, earlier this month, the IRS shared that 7 million people have successfully used their non-filer tool to sign up for their payments. They also announced that they will be sending letters out to 9 million people that, based on the data that they do have, people who have filed a tax return at some point in the past, they have identified 9 million people who may be eligible for these payments and aren't getting them. They also are using data from W-2 forms and information from employers. So we know between 5 and 9 million people still have not been reached. So this is part of the need and part of the urgency for outreach, is to help reach these remaining people, to answer questions that they may have that are preventing people from signing up. Some people may not realize that they're eligible. You can get the payments even if you don't have income, if you don't have a mailing address, and if you don't have a bank account. These are some of the common barriers and concerns to address. And so also, people need help with the form, especially if they aren't used to filing taxes. And when the stimulus payments first rolled out, there wasn't really a lot of sources for help. And now there are some sources available. So I will go over those in talking about resources. We've identified 3 main roles that people can play to help assist in outreach efforts. So the first level of engagement is notifiers, and at the minimum, people can help notify potentially eligible people about the payments and how to get help or how to sign up. The next level of engagement is refers. And if there's a local community partner in your area, you can collaborate with them to help make warm referrals for completing the form and for getting the help that's needed. And if you don't already know where local groups are helping people, then your United Way is a good place to start. And then the final role is the role of an assister. And this is the most hands-on level of help. This is where people are helping others to complete the form, providing side-by-side assistance, or completing the form on their behalf by asking questions. And so with these 3 roles, we know that organizations have different capacities, definitely have a lot of other issues to focus on as well. And so whatever role people choose, there's a potential to make a huge impact in helping people. So now I'll go over some of the resources that are available. There's about 4 different categories of resources that I'll highlight. So first is an outreach toolkit. When you go to the link that you see on the screen, first you'll see this column, this image to the left. And so it first highlights different research papers that have been done. I mentioned the 12 million number. There's data that has the number on a state-by-state basis to help make it more localized. But when you scroll to the bottom of the page, you can see this image on the right, which includes elements of our toolkit. And so the toolkit does include some scripts for the different roles that I mentioned: assister, notifier, and refer. These tools and resources, here's a list of everything that's part of the toolkit. The toolkit is specifically designed with state agencies in mind to help encourage them to do outreach. All of the tools are adaptable though, and it's available in English and Spanish. Next is our Stimulus Outreach Hub, and there's lots of resources here, including a 30-day plan with weekly suggestions of in-person and remote outreach. And there's flyers, there's guides if you wanted to take on the assister role of how to complete the form. And so all of these links are accessible from this landing page here, including the link to the toolkit. Also, there are other organizations that have great resources for help. United Way's 211 Economic Impact Helpline can help answer eligibility questions and walk people through completing the form. GetYourRefund.org is a mobile-friendly platform that uses IRS-certified volunteers to help people complete the form and either complete the form or file taxes if that is a better option for someone. And then the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has a guide to helping people get their payments and also helping troubleshoot. If you've seen that some people have signed up, but they haven't gotten their payments, this guide walks through ways to support people. And then, of course, the IRS has a lot of resources. These are some of the key ones. I want to highlight that they now have a hotline available where you can talk to someone that wasn't available before, and that's also a great resource for people who need to troubleshoot. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Roxy. And just to remind folks, the deadline for collecting the stimulus checks, that's October 15th, is that right?
That's correct, yes. That's the deadline for people to sign up so that they can get their payment this year.
Wonderful, great. And I know there's been a lot of questions in the past about how we make sure that people who are experiencing homelessness have access to the stimulus checks. I'm going to ask Kim if she can share some of the resources NLHC has put together about specific ways that groups can be reaching out to and helping people who are experiencing homelessness get these funds. But thank you so much, Roxy, for being on the call, and thanks for all of your work making sure that people get the assistance that they're entitled to.
Thank you again for having me.
Absolutely. We're going to turn now to some field updates. We're going to start with Dev Wakely from Alabama Rise, who's going to talk about issues that he's seeing on the ground in his community. Dev?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here. I cover human rights issues like housing for Alabama Rise. We are a member-directed policy and advocacy organization, working primarily at the state level, but also some federally more recently. And I'm glad to be here, but I wish it were under better circumstances. Mostly what we're seeing right now is a real scramble on the ground to address the major issues that have resulted from Hurricane Sally. There are lots of folks who still have no power, and when I've been trying to contact our direct service providers in Baldwin County, most of them are still incommunicado. I've actually only been able to reach one shelter, and they just got power and phone service back yesterday. So they're yesterday pretty late too, after business hours, such as business hours are on a Sunday, I suppose. But that's really what we're dealing with. There are about 100,000 people who still have no electrical service down there. In terms of how that affects the population of Baldwin County, which was the hardest hit, it's not as bad as it could have been if it had been, if the hurricane had gone a little bit to the west. Baldwin County's homeless population is a little bit lower than Mobile County's. So in terms of people who would already have been in these shelters, it's a little bit better a situation than we would have expected if it had hit on the original path. That said, we don't know exactly how bad it's going to be just because I don't have the data right now, because I haven't been able to get in touch with anyone. That's primarily what we're seeing. Baldwin County and Mobile actually, in some areas, are operating on basically a sunset to sunrise curfew at the moment. And South Baldwin County has restricted entry of basically anyone who doesn't live in the area and is not providing emergency relief services. That is expected for at least another 5 days, could be extended. Unlikely to be extended in general South Baldwin area, but could well extend in the beachfront communities more so, that have experienced much heavier damage. In terms of fatalities, we haven't seen that many. Just a couple, just a handful really so far at this point, which is lucky considering the incredible amount of storm surge and the fact that the hurricane basically parked over South Alabama for a little while before making landfall. Insofar as that's affected our broader low-income housing advocacy work, it's really kind of taken over over the last week really. Expectations and the fact that things are much more severe than they initially looked to be. Statewide, we're still seeing people who, we're still seeing courts operating with evictions, but of course not in South Alabama right now. So our primary focus right now has been on addressing the harms caused by the hurricane. And we expect to go back sometime in the next couple of weeks to addressing the general issues that we're seeing in terms of coronavirus evictions and the massive economic damage that we're seeing generally. There has not been a comprehensive plan set forth by the state government or of course the federal government to address what we're seeing or what we will see in terms of economic damage from the hurricane. Honestly, I expect it's a little too early to expect that. But we could always hope for it. In this case, that hope did not materialize yet, and we're hoping to see some actions taken in that realm in the near future. So that's really what we're seeing right now, heavily on the ground right here in Alabama. That's our primary focus, and we'll get back to the normal fight in a couple of weeks.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Yeah. I know that this call, a lot of our focus has been on the pandemic and its impacts, but just a reminder to folks that so much of the work we've been doing on disasters have been more in this traditional space. But I'm wondering, Deb, it sounds like you're still in the very beginning stages of trying to get information, but is there anything that you know about what the impact has been on housing, destruction to homes, or the needs of people on the ground?
I don't have any numbers yet at all. In terms of needs, they've been pretty good at clearing a path in to get disaster response teams on the ground and responding as necessary. But I don't know to what extent that response has been necessary. I will say that considering the shockingly high winds that increased right before landfall of this hurricane and how long it was parking, from what I can tell visually, there hasn't been as much wind damage as I would have expected and have seen in the past, and I'm pretty grateful for that. That's a little better than I would have thought things would have ended up as of 1 a.m.
It's good to hear there's some positive or hopeful signs, I guess, when it comes to recovery. And I know that you have so much work on your hands right now, but thank you so much for joining our call. We appreciate your update.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Absolutely. We'll turn now to Allison McIntosh from Neighborhood Partnerships in Oregon. Allison, go ahead.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks for having me. My name is Allison McIntosh, and I work for Neighborhood Partnerships and convene the Oregon Housing Alliance here in Oregon. Thank you again for having me, and I really want to say thank you to all of the coalition for your work to support disaster recovery and response. I was asked to talk a little bit about the wildfires here in Oregon, and I would just start by saying that the scale of the wildfires that we've seen this year has been a disaster that we haven't yet experienced in Oregon. I'm really appreciative of all of the work of the coalition in answering all of our many questions about FEMA and the response and what we should be expecting and how we can start to manage this. The fires began on Labor Day. It was a combination of some hot weather and drought and a very high wind situation. Counties that were impacted were primarily on the western side of the state, Southern Oregon, Jackson County, Lane, Douglas, Lincoln, Klamath, Marion, Washington, and Clackamas County. So a really big area and many large fires. 4 of the fires impacted some very pretty high population areas and communities, and those communities really haven't been in this position before to be experiencing really large wildfires. We had about 40,000 folks who were evacuated from their homes and some pretty large major urban areas that were under the Get Ready orders. A lot of those Get Ready orders have now been scaled back as firefighters have been able to really start to contain the fires, and the winds have died down and the weather has really shifted here. I wanted to talk a little bit about the impacts that we've seen. Southern Oregon was the site of some pretty major devastation in terms of impact on communities where folks were living. In Jackson County, the fires really ripped through 2 towns, both Phoenix and Talent, Oregon. About 2,400 residential structures or homes were lost or damaged, including 1,600 manufactured homes in 15 parks were affected by the fires. And those were homes to seniors and a lot of Latinx families. And most of those homes were just absolutely destroyed. The pictures are pretty devastating. There were also 3 affordable housing projects that were lost. And what we heard last week was that about half of the kids in that Phoenix Talent School District lost their homes. So really devastating impact on that community. The other fires, I think we're just starting to now learn the impact of those fires. We know that about 400 homes were lost in one of the other fires, but those fires are much more active still, and a lot of those areas are still under evacuation orders. So we're not yet clear on the impact of those. In addition to the devastation caused directly by the fire, there was also a lot of impact because of the smoke and really poor air quality. I know Shannon Singleton from the governor's office last week talked a little bit about that. And I will say in better news, we saw some relief with some weather shifting over the weekend to provide some relief from some of the worst air quality. We had about a week and a half of some really serious and negative air quality that was affecting folks experiencing homelessness, folks with poor health conditions, as well as many agricultural workers who ended up needing to stay in the fields to keep their jobs. A lot of the smoke shelters that were open to help folks get out of that situation have now been closed, but we still see a lot of folks who are directly impacted by it. So now what's happening is we're just barely starting to get our arms around what the FEMA response will be. We're trying to answer basic questions from people. As you all who have been through this before no doubt know, there's a lot of both misinformation, some initial response from both FEMA and insurance companies. We're starting to hear reports of people who have registered with FEMA who have already gotten an initial denial that it's causing a lot of confusion and concern and fear about what's next and what will happen. We're also seeing some really amazing community response. I would highlight there's been a lot of really amazing mutual aid efforts in Southern Oregon. The Community Action Agency down there has stood up basically a home share program website where folks can offer a spare bedroom or another unit in their home to somebody who's been impacted by the fires. So a lot of creativity and good things coming out of the fires and the devastation as well. I think a lot of folks are also now turning their thoughts to how do we start to rebuild these, thinking about both the land use system and the cost to rebuild, as well as whether park owners want to rebuild those parks, and making sure that we're thinking about how do we rebuild our community to meet the needs of what people have rather than just what developers want to build. So we're starting to really think about that. And I would just note that prior to the fires, Jackson County was already experiencing a pretty severe housing crisis. About 2 years ago, they had a vacancy rate of less than 1%, really limited rental housing supply, and rapidly rising rents and pretty stagnant and low wages. So I'm sure I will be calling on many of you to help us as we start to navigate this, these next steps. And thank you for having me here today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Allison. And I'm seeing people in the chat box also saying that we're just so sorry for the devastation that's happening in Oregon, and thankful for all of your work and focus and leadership on people who have the greatest needs there. So we'll be in touch soon with you about ways we can help supporting your efforts. Great. We'll move on to our next speaker, Jasmine Boyle from the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. Jasmine, go ahead. Jasmine, are you there? You might have to unmute your line. I think we might have an issue with Jasmine on the line. I'm going to go ahead with my Capitol Hill update, and if Jasmine is able to join us, I'll pause my update. Things are pretty chaotic on the Hill right now. As you can imagine, the biggest news of the week, obviously, is the passing of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and her death is just, especially of such a formidable advocate for equality and justice and civil rights. It's just a tremendous loss for our nation. And, it's really important, I think, in recognizing her passing that we call out the great contributions that she made in the fight for justice and for ending discrimination, particularly for women, but also on housing issues and fair housing in particular. So I just wanted to call that out before I mention what politically her passing means, which is that it makes everything that's in Congress, from passing a COVID relief bill to a disaster response bill to spending bills, all the more complicated and fraught and unknown. There is just a lot more questions and answers right now about what the next couple of months look for. It's really difficult to predict what exactly this means for the work that we do. I do know that we can get ready for epic battles ahead and massive levels of toxicity on the Hill, and that the coming months really will be dominated by debates over the next Supreme Court nomination. It also seems like her passing and the political response to it means that it's going to be increasingly difficult to see a path forward on a COVID relief bill before the election. It was already pretty difficult. We had spoken about how last week Speaker Pelosi and the White House agreed to keep a continuing resolution, which is needed to keep the government open. They agreed to keep that clean, meaning that they wouldn't be attaching a relief package to that CR. And of course, we've seen negotiations have been stalled for the last couple of weeks too. But now adding a Supreme Court nominee fight, it makes everything a little bit more unclear about what's going to happen. We really have no idea how this Supreme Court fight changes the strategies for Democrats and Republicans going forward. We could easily see Democrats use a CR or a spending bill or any other legislation as leverage over a Supreme Court fight. We could see things pass as normal, right? It's just really unknown right now. I think we're also need to keep in mind that we have really no idea what is going to happen with the economy now that it seems less likely that a COVID relief bill will happen before the elections. That could also have a major impact if, for example, there was a shift in the stock market that could push Congress back to the negotiating table again. So all of that is to say that there are so many unknowns out there right now. We'll keep in touch with you guys as we learn more as this unfolds. But from our perspective, it seems like it's really important for us to continue to do the work that we have been doing to be in a position where we're ready to advocate and push for a COVID relief bill if there's an opening. We just don't know exactly when, what that will look like. So I just want to encourage you guys to continue to do the work that you've been doing. Keep your eye on the need for an emergency rental assistance, for example, and our national moratorium, the other resources that we've been pushing for. Continue to advocate with your members of Congress. Keep them informed about what's happening in your communities and urge them to take action so that when there's an opening, we're really primed to be able to jump through that hoop. That's really all I have to share with you guys about what's going on the Hill. I'm sorry it couldn't be more clear. Things are, like I said, are all topsy-turvy here on the Hill right now, but I want to thank you all for joining our call. We appreciate your participation, and we look forward to talking with you guys soon.